the current Duke of the Empire of Darches. The father asked the protagonist what she was doing. He asked if she was out of her mind. He asked where her decency was. Father asked the protagonist if she had forgotten that she was the daughter of a duke. He asked how dare she come back after what happened. But the main character just didn't care. Her name is Meliara Darches. Her father told her that she had disgraced the whole family and made a laughing stock of them. He asked how she could. The duchy has been around for 3 generations, and Meliara is now the second daughter of the current head, and also the crown prince's political bride. Ex-fiancée to be exact. Other than that, the main character isn't even the real Meliara. She's Korean in this body. This novel is called Eradicate Evil, Embrace Good. The crown prince is the main character, endowed with good looks and power. A saintly protagonist, kind and patient. Meliara believed that based on the title, this novel calls for overcoming evil and coming over to the side of good. And here, when it seems that the story has a happy ending at the wedding of the main characters, suddenly comes a demon and turns the holiday into hell. All the minor characters were killed that day. The protagonist thought it was a deadly ending. Meliara packed her suitcase and started to leave the house. She didn't understand why she'd been struck dead in her previous life, and why she was lucky enough to be reborn in a world about to be destroyed. What's more, the girl she became used to be bullied by her own father. After the wedding was cancelled, she was thrown out of the house. Meliara thought she was just another villain with a tragic fate, so she decided not to live such a miserable existence. Meliara realized that in that case, she would be better off leaving the empire altogether, because in 3 months there's going to be a demon that's going to leave no stone unturned. The protagonist realized that that's why it would be better if she was kicked out now, so she left the estate in a pathetic manner. Mentally addressing her father, the protagonist told him to die in the hell presented by the demon. After Meliara left the house, she opened a suitcase with a huge amount of jewelry. She realized that any escape required money and wondered where she could exchange it all. Meliara realized that she was the 3rd daughter of a generation of the ducal family, so she was likely to be recognized in the shops of the main street. Meliara thought that was why she would need to taste the outskirts. At that moment, Meliara heard a dog barking and was very happy because she adores animals. But after Meliara turned around, she was scared of the dog she saw, for the hound of hell was upon her. Meliara didn't realize that such creatures really lived here. She hoped the dog wouldn't come near her, but at that moment the hellhound jumped towards Meliara. The main character was very frightened and covered herself with her hands. But at that moment, hellfire started licking her, which really surprised the main character. The hellhound was very kind and licked Meliara. The main character assumed it was just a dog with 3 heads. At this moment, the hellhound fell on its back and wagged its tail. The main character smiled and asked the dog if she really wanted her tummy scratched. But that's when the dog's owner came in and named him Kelbert. The stranger asked Kelbert why he was suddenly rushing off in a strange direction. Meliara looked at the guy and was surprised by his beauty enough to be a little embarrassed. She didn't realize if he was definitely human. After all, the guy was completely her type. But at this point, the protagonist told herself to come to her senses. She asked the guy if it was his baby. With a stony face, the stranger replied that yes. At that point, he asked, since when did Kelbert act so friendly with strangers? He said it was new. But Meliara smiled at the stranger and said that animals were always hanging around her. In her past life, the protagonist was constantly surrounded by animals of all kinds. At that moment, Meliara said that Kelbert was very charming. She told the stranger that she was curious how the 3 of them would get along, since they each had their own personalities. The stranger interrogated the 3 of them. But the main character said the dog has 3 heads. She asked if she thought there were 3. Weird. At this point, the stranger began to look sternly at the protagonist. Meliara was surprised and asked if something was wrong. But at that moment, the stranger grabbed Meliara and pulled her towards him. The protagonist didn't understand why he did it so suddenly. At this point, the protagonist thought she was very lucky. Meliara told the stranger that she was just taking a walk as he suddenly. But the stranger interrupted her and wanted to say something. But before he could say a word, he was interrupted by the butler who ran towards them. Meliara stammered and stood up. Butler thanked her for her help in the search. Meliara realized that the man must be a butler, judging by his costume and manners. She told him she was just passing by. The protagonist looked at the stranger and realized he was a nobleman. She thought that's why he looked so splendid. She thought the guy was incredibly handsome. The longer she looked at him, the more she was convinced he was completely her type. But at that moment they met glances, which embarrassed Meliara, and she turned to the butler. The butler told her it was a small thing, but asked her to accept it as a gift. The protagonist didn't look at what she was being offered and started saying, "No thanks needed." But at that moment she saw that the butler was offering her 2 gold coins. Meliara was surprised because she thought that just by playing with the dog she had been given enough money to live in a prestigious place for 10 days. She immediately changed her mind and said that the butler was right, and it was rude to refuse gifts. She realized that people changed their minds too quickly, so it was better to take what they were given. The protagonist took the coins and said she'd go then. When Meliara left, the butler told his master that she was a very nice girl. But at that moment the butler noticed that the lad was puzzled and asked if something was wrong. The guy told him it was really weird. At this point he called out to a random guy off the street. He said he had a question. The guy asked the stranger how many heads this dog had. The stranger was startled and said he was alone. After that, he was released. The butler asked the gentleman if he was worried about something. He said that Kelbert was under a spell so that ordinary people saw him as a common dog. But the guy said the main character saw 3 heads. He said she saw through Kelbert's illusion. The butler was surprised and said it couldn't be. He asked if she was of the demon race or had made a contract with one of them. But the boy said he didn't think so. Butler asked him then it was because of her. But the guy turned his back on the butler and said it couldn't be. The main character and the girl from his memories have nothing in common. They even look different. At that point, I told him to look into it. He thought that appearances might be different and wondered what about the soul. He thought he might find the answer this time. The protagonist, meanwhile. Meliara realized she had the check in her pocket, and the first thing she wanted to do was go shopping. After a while, the protagonist picked out her clothes. Then when she came out of the shop, she saw a tavern. After a while, she got very full. She had wanted to try it since the very first day, as it turned out in the novel. Meliara realized that she had already found comfortable clothes and satisfied her hunger. She realized that now she had to work out an escape plan. The place will soon be destroyed by the Demon King, so she must leave the Empire as quickly as possible. The protagonist decided that afterwards she would go in search of the Kion mentioned in the novel. Kion is a sacred religion used for defense. It exists only in eradicate evil, embrace good. Meliara thought who knows maybe he could save her life. But the problem was that Kion is in Archduke Arvis's moon temple. And the difficulty is that Arvis is the Demon King who will destroy the Empire. But the protagonist realized that he hadn't been seen for a century. She didn't understand why he was suddenly attacking the Empire. Randomly out loud, the protagonist asked and why it was necessary to live in the world of humans, pretending to be one of them. At that moment, a guy came up behind her and asked her what else the Demon King was. The guy said he didn't even know some ladies were so bad at drawing. He asked drawing is one of the basic skills a duke's daughter should have, isn't it? The main heroine was very surprised by the appearance of the guy because she thought he was handsome. She thought he was so beautiful that he evoked maternal feelings. Meliara felt that the prize of idolizing millions would belong to him alone. But at that moment, Meliara wondered who he was. She thought it was rare to meet people like him in a place like this. At this point, the guy started to sit down at the table and told the protagonist that when he saw her in trousers, he thought he was mistaken. But the protagonist asked him what the big deal was. She still didn't understand who the guy was. She didn't know if he knew Meliara. But she thought that now. But she did. She figured he hadn't realized, had he? At this point, the guy started looking at the main character in surprise. Meliara asked him if something was wrong, but the guy said that it was just that she used to address him as you. The protagonist was surprised and said that they hadn't seen each other for so long that she had forgotten. She didn't realize they weren't friends. She didn't understand why they had to address each other so familiarly. But the guy started smiling and said he even liked it. He said it would bring them a little closer. He said that if she was going to address him differently, she should call him differently. Meliara was glad and asked differently how. She thought the guy was really cute. She didn't understand if it was legal to make that facial expression. The guy told the protagonist that calling him His Highness was still too formal, so he asked him to call him by his first name, Lyndon. At that moment, the protagonist realized something. Lyndon Ezerson van Bacarda, second prince of the Empire. And he's in the novel as a minor male character. At this point, Lyndon asked Meliara if something was wrong. The main character thought she was finished. She said it was just a little hot in here. She didn't think she'd meet any more of the main characters. But she didn't understand what the prince was doing in a place like this. Meliara thought it was quite far from the capital. Because of his dead mother, who was a concubine, Grandpa Ezerson raised Lyndon outside the palace. Consequently, most people have no idea what the second prince looks like. At this point, Lyndon turned to the protagonist. Meliara asked what was wrong. Lyndon put his hand to her forehead as if checking the temperature. The guy said she didn't have a fever, but said if she wasn't feeling well, she could go home. Meliara's heart began to beat faster, but she said it was okay. She thought it was impossible to react to a sweet face and a velvet voice, even if they are in the world of the novel. Meliara thought Lyndon was a conniving man who would do anything to be with the main character. At this point, Lyndon said he'd heard about her engagement breaking off and asked if she was okay. At that moment, Meliara wondered if he was sitting so close to her because he wanted to take advantage of her, or because his target is the Duke's third daughter. But the protagonist thought she was no longer connected to the family. She decided it was time to end it. The main character stood up abruptly and said that breaking off the engagement had put her in a bit of a bad mood, but she said she had a lot of work to do now, so they would finish up. Meliara started to walk away and the guy tried to stop her. She didn't know if it came off too rough, but she thought she'd better not get involved with this guy at all. At this point, Meliara wondered what if he was just genuinely concerned for his friend, because that's when his grandfather died, and Lyndon himself had a lot of responsibilities. At that moment, the protagonist turned around and walked over to the guy. She thanked him for worrying about her. She said it made her feel better. She said if he ever needed support, he should look her up. Meliara said she didn't think she'd be able to find the right words in a difficult moment, but she said she could at least listen. She thought that the main character would be comforting the boy soon anyway. At that moment, Lyndon asked Meliara to call him by his first name. He said there was no need for this formality. After all, they had an agreement. The protagonist agreed and thought the guy was being childish. But at that moment, Kelbert ran into the tavern. He lunged at the protagonist and knocked her to the ground. The protagonist was surprised and didn't understand why Kelbert was here. At this point, Lyndon helped the girl up and asked if she was okay. At that moment, a stranger came inside the building and called Kelbert over to him. He said it was rude. Meliara marveled at her. She told her that here they were, meeting again. She went up to a stranger and told him she had changed her hair. She said it was more comfortable to wear a ponytail and asked if it looked strange. The stranger said it was beautiful and that a ponytail suits her better. Meliara asked the stranger in surprise if he would stay here today. The boy answered that for the time being, yes. At this point, Lyndon asked the protagonist who he was. Meliara said that she had met this gentleman during the day and that he was Kelbert's master. Lyndon said it was nice to meet you and gave his name, but the stranger just stared back in silence. Lyndon asked if he wasn't going to introduce himself in response, but not an acquaintance asked why he would do that. At that moment, the protagonist realized that she was in trouble. She didn't understand why the boys would suddenly clash. She realized that anyone hearing Lyndon's surname would immediately know that he was from the imperial family. Lyndon asked the stranger if that was too rude. He said decent people don't behave like that. At that moment, Lyndon's hidden guards began to stand behind him, but the stranger said those were his words. All of the prince's guards fell to their knees and began coughing. Lyndon was surprised and asked what it was. At that moment, the stranger began to approach Meliara. He said his name was Licht. The protagonist introduced herself in response, but the guy replied briefly that he already knew that. Meliara said he could call her that then. Meliara was surprised to hear a name from the past. At this point, Licht asked the protagonist they hadn't met anywhere before. The protagonist was surprised and said she had to think about it. She didn't realize that the guy knew the real Meliara. At this point, the protagonist said that she didn't recall them ever seeing each other before, but she said it was a good time to get to know each other. But she said she's leaving soon so they don't have much time. Licht was surprised and asked where she was going. The protagonist explained that she would be going to the east, to a Chiban village. The protagonist started to say that next time it would be a must, but at that moment the guy interrupted her and said he would go with her. He said he had to go east and it wasn't safe outside the city lately. He said he'd be safer with him. Meliara told him he didn't need to do that. She said they'd known each other less than 24 hours. The protagonist said the journey would only take a couple of days and she'd be a burden to him, but Licht said if she didn't trust him, he could swear an oath. At that moment, Licht began to pull out his dagger. He began to hold the dagger over his palm and said he swore by the lake of moonlight that he would do no harm. He said he would keep the protagonist safe from any misfortune as long as she reached her destination safely. Stabbing himself in the palm of his hand, the lad said, "May the moon god punish him," and if his promise was broken. Meliara didn't know what the guy was even thinking. At this point, she shouted for him to stop. Meliara took his hands and told him not to do that. She smiled and offered to ship together. The Moonlight Lake Oath is a pledge of a man's own life that he believes in the moon god, a meal brought by a lover before a battle. Meliara realized that it was better not to break it or it would be bad. She thought she'd only left the mansion a few days ago and this was already happening. She said she thought she'd have to go alone, but she said it was much safer with Licht. Lita smiled and said that was correct. Next morning, the main character woke up and asked Kelbert if he slept well. At that moment, the butler came to Meliara and asked how she had slept. He said he was glad to see them again and called the main character mistress. Meliara said she too was glad they had met again, but she asked to be called by her first name from now on. The butler called the protagonist mistress but added her first name. He asked her to address him as Tanma. Meliara didn't understand why she would add mistress since that wasn't what she was talking about. But the butler said breakfast was ready and suggested she go. When the protagonist came down, she was greeted by Lyndon and asked if she was rested. Meliara said yes. She asked the guys if they slept well. She thought it was one that had gone out of her sight early in the morning. At this point, Lyndon gave Meliara her plate and said the food here wasn't bad and told her to try it. The main character was surprised because she couldn't remember the last time she had a proper breakfast. On the way to work, and it was usually limited to toast and a drink, because the combination of office work and a heavy breakfast guarantees a bloated stomach. But she was ready for it, so she started eating. But at that moment, Licht held out the bread to her. And after that, a glass of some kind of drink. That if she ate too much now, she wouldn't be able to get up from the table later. Meliara took the glass and thanked the guy. At this point, she tasted the drink he gave her. This surprised Meliara greatly, and she wondered if it was her drink. She thought there was such a thing in this world too. Licht asked Meliara if it tasted good. The protagonist said the drink was lovely as a boyfriend, but at that moment realized what she'd said. She thought that since there was flour from the grains in this world, why not a drink from it? At this point, Licht told the girl that it would be better with honey than sugar. Meliara said she agreed. She thought the boy's face was very beautiful now. She started drinking what she was given and thought it was illegal. At this point, Linton asked Meliara if she said she was going to the Chaban village, right? He said he had received a letter this morning, so he had to go east too. He asked if they could go together. The cute look on the guy's face kind of asked if it was impossible. The main character was dazzled by his beauty and said, no, you can't. At this point, she asked Licht if he minded. Licht said that if Meliara was okay with it, so was he. But the main heroine was surprised, because yesterday they were like a cat and a dog, and today everything is normal. She would have wanted Licht to oppose you, as going with the prince was a bit awkward, but she thought it looked like this guy had no reason to refuse. She said she's fine with it. The main character said that since they'd had breakfast, they could leave. After a while, they went down the street to the carriage. Meliara asked Licht if it was his carriage. Licht said yes. He pulled the protagonist's arm and told her to climb inside. Meliara started to refuse and said it wasn't necessary. She said just borrow a public one. But Licht asked why drive separately on the same road. Meliara took the guy's hand and apologized for her tactlessness. She also thanked the boy. Lyndon told the protagonist what they would see in a few days in the capital. That was the moment he looked at Licht and silence hung. Lyndon said his carriage hadn't arrived yet. He asked if he could go with them. That night, Lyndon told Licht that his father had told him about him. Lyndon said he didn't think they would ever meet in person. But Licht told Lyndon to listen to him carefully. Licht told Lyndon not to tell Meliara who he was, because Licht is actually an archduke. As a child, Lyndon once overheard a conversation between His Majesty and her older brother. Her father told the crown prince whatever happened, he must not get in the way of the Archduke of Arvis. Zekin said that they are the imperial family after all, and asked why. But his father told him that it was not about their power or wealth, but something else entirely. He said that therefore, whatever madness was going on around him, he must not contradict this being. His father told the prince that if he pointed his sword at them, the whole empire would be a wasteland. Lyndon understood all that, but he couldn't do that. He asked Licht what he was up to. The main character was traveling in a carriage with the guys, and she was very uncomfortable. Meliara thought maybe it was because Lyndon was here too. After all, he'd asked to go inside before he left, and the protagonist said yes. Afterwards, she apologized to Licht because it wasn't even her carriage. But the guy said it was okay. He told her to do whatever she wanted. At this point, the protagonist realized that they would be driving the next 3 days in the same carriage. She realized that she had to break the awkwardness somehow. At this point, Meliara stood up and suggested that the guys have some proper fun when they got to the Chaban. But there was something she had overlooked. The protagonist herself was surprised to find herself seasick in the carriage. Licht told the girl that they were becoming here and would rest for a while. After a while, Meliara was brought to the inn. Lyndon asked if she would be okay if she was alone. The protagonist said she was. She told the guy to worry. Lyndon said he would go and look for motion sickness medicine. He told the protagonist to rest. Meliara realized that she had seasickness in her previous life as well, but she didn't expect it to remain even after moving into another body. The protagonist remembered that chamomile tea was the best thing for motion sickness. She didn't know if it would be difficult to find it here. At that moment, there was a knock on the room and the protagonist said let her come in. Afterwards, Licht entered the room along with a mug of tea. He told the protagonist to drink it. Meliara took the mug and asked what it was. Licht said it was chamomile tea. This really shocked the main character. She asked the guy how. Licht explained that Tanma said it was great for motion sickness. The main character said she understood. She realized that means there's one here too. After Meliara drank the tea, she looked very happy. Afterwards, she thanked the boy. At that moment, Licht said he had cast a spell to keep the tea hot. He told the girl to rest today, and tomorrow they would continue on their way. When Licht was leaving, Meliara told him he was very kind. But the guy didn't say anything back and told the protagonist to rest. Licht left the room thinking that the main character had just repeated the words of a girl from his past. He thought that maybe this time he wasn't wrong. When Licht came downstairs, he told the butler to have the Archduke's carriage brought here. Butler thought about it and said he reckoned it would help against motion sickness. But he said that if the protagonist saw her. But Licht said if he saw her, then they'd be convinced of her abilities. The butler cheerfully asked if they weren't convinced, but Licht said it wasn't enough that she'd seen Kelbert's true nature. The butler asked would the one in doubt search the whole village for chamomile tea. The butler said the Archduke he knows is not like that. He asked Licht if he believed she was the one. But Licht said the main character doesn't remember him at all, and also looks different. But the butler said it was impossible not to recognize her smile. Licht said it was. He said he knows how she wrinkles her lips every time she gets nervous. The way he rolls his eyes when he's watching something. How she likes Kelbert. Licht said he knows how little she eats for breakfast. How she looks for chamomile tea to get rid of her nausea. Licht said he remembers it all too clearly. The butler wanted to say something, but the guy interrupted him and said that they would be able to make sure once they arrived at the temple. Butler thought that apparently Licht still hadn't forgotten that day. 2 years ago. Archduke Arvis's estates. One day, the saint that the sun goddess worshipped appeared to the Archduke's family to give her blessing. But then the Arwis already worshipped the moon god, accepting his patronage with blessing. They did not need the gift of any other deity. Then Licht said he was annoyed with the holy sun goddess. The butler asked him if it would be better for them to get along with her. He said it would only get worse if he ignored her. Licht said the man was right and ordered the girl down. Since the Duke had no intention of spoiling relations with another religion, he willingly let the girl into the manor. However, he suddenly pointed at Kelbert. She noted that the dog had 3 heads. Butler thought that girl just had a contract with a demon, and Licht was waiting for her at all. Butler hoped the lad wouldn't be upset this time. At this point, suddenly one guy felt sick. He started coughing up purple liquid. Licht was shocked. He said it was the color of blood. The main character was asleep and heard her name in her dreams. She didn't realize if someone was calling her. Meliara Gavrilina opened her eyes, but she thought she wasn't in a shelter and didn't realize who might be calling her. At that moment, the main character was called loudly and woke up in surprise. Lyndon asked Meliara if she was okay. The main character asked what happened and why they surrounded her while she slept. She didn't understand if she was drooling while she slept. But Lyndon asked Meliara if she was feeling okay and if she was having trouble breathing. The protagonist said she was fine. She asked if something had happened. Lyndon told the doctor that thank God she was fine. He explained that there was just an epidemic in the village at the moment. After a while they went outside, and Lyndon told Meliara that things were much worse than imagined. He said that almost half of the inhabitants were already infected. He said that there was very little space for the sick, although additional tents had been set up in the square. Lyndon said he had used his power to isolate the village, but he said that didn't solve the problem. He said that he would very much like Meliara to leave this dangerous place. But the protagonist refused and said she didn't need such privileges. She said that their situation was too urgent, so she would try to help too. Lyndon thanked Meliara and asked her to wait for a moment. He received a call on his magic transmitter. The magical transmitter helps to maintain communication over long distances. The protagonist thought that although Lyndon is not well known among the people, but such moments he as a prince is obliged to take responsibility. Meliara decided that she too would try to help her to the best of her ability, even if it was just small errands. After a while, Meliara was already helping. After a while, she asked Licht what the doctor said. He said that without holy magic it would be difficult with only medicine. Meliara said it was bad. She said it would be easier if they knew the cause of the disease. Licht hesitated and said he would try to deal with it. At this point, he asked the main character what about her. He said that she had said she was going to rest, but she was running errands. But Meliara said it would be strange to lie down in such a situation. At that moment, she told Licht that he had said they couldn't do it without holy magic. She then asked if she should contact the temple. At this point, Meliara wondered if the novel had said anything about this. Meliara remembered that the main character in the novel was a saint, Olivia. Meliara thought that she was now a character in a novel. She didn't understand why she knew so little. At that point, Licht said he wasn't going to appeal, but Meliara didn't hear him and asked again. But Licht said it was nothing important. Meliara started to leave and said that she would take her things and come back. Licht agreed. The protagonist thought it was strange because Licht's answer was strange. In the evening, Meliara finished her sibilance and sat down to rest. At that moment, Licht approached her and asked if she was resting. Meliara was surprised and said that he was busy and asked why he had come. Licht said that there was something he wanted to tell her earlier. But at that moment, they heard an aggressive shout. Meliara ran with Licht to Lyndon and asked what was wrong. Lyndon explained that he had finally contacted the palace and asked for help, but they refused to send help. He said he explained the whole situation, but they thought it was a small thing. Meliara didn't realize it was a small thing. Sadly, Lyndon said that even in times like this, it's politics that decides everything. Meliara realized that the Crown Prince's strength lies in his cooperation with the Magic Tower, whereas the second prince, Lyndon, is a speck in the eye for those who support the Emperor's first son. He holds powerful magic in his hands. That's why everything about the second prince irritates them. But the protagonist wondered if politics was more important than the people of the Empire. She thought it was too selfish. At this point, Lyndon asked Meliara if she could try to contact the first prince. Meliara said it would be difficult. She said people are still talking after the engagement broke up. Lyndon immediately apologized and said he didn't mean to push the hurt, but the protagonist thought that she should apologize for the fact that she could not help, since she and the Crown Prince were no longer connected. Meliara tells Lyndon that she thinks they can only hope for the temple, but even then, things are not so simple. Because even before the protagonist appeared, Meliara was suspected of murdering the saint. The protagonist wasn't sure if they would even listen to her, but she realized that there was no other way out. Meliara sighed sadly and said that human lives should not be a bargaining chip in a power struggle. At that moment, the protagonist realized something. She said that aside from the Sun Temple and the magic tower of the palace, there was another power that could help them. Lyndon said they had no one else to rely on. But the main character told the guys to think about it. She said there's more to the Empire than just the sun god. Meliara said that where there is day-night rules. The protagonist said the Lunarians serve the moon god. and it was their temple that Meliara wanted to go to in the first place. Meliara said that the Lunars are on bad terms with the Solars, so they would welcome her. Licht asked the girl but how she would contact the Haram. At that moment, Meliara realized that she hadn't even thought about it. She said that if she asked around the nearest guilds, but Licht interrupted her and said it wouldn't work. He explained that the Lunarians do not use devices to communicate like the Solarians. However, there is another way. At that moment, Licht gave Meliara an object he had on a chain, and the protagonist asked what it was. But the guy told her to just blow into it. When Meliara blew into it, some unknown music played. Linden said it's a very beautiful sound. At this point, Meliara began to ask if this was really how they would be able to connect. But at that moment, she was interrupted by a bird. Licht looked at the bird and said, "Here it comes." After that, sat on his arm. The main character was very surprised and pleased by this. She said the bird was very cute and asked if she could pet it. Licht explained that this kid is forcing the letters, and with his help, the Lunarians will get their message. At that moment, Meliara was stroking the bird and told Linden to try it too. She said it had very soft feathers, but Linden moved very quickly away from Meliara. The protagonist assumed he didn't like animals, but Linden thought the heroine was very brave to pet that bird so calmly. He thought that even a dog the size of a wolf was cuter. At this point, the protagonist handed the bird to Licht and said she would bring a pen and a leaf, and they would write a letter. But after these words, the little boy asked Meliara if that sound was her whistle making. Meliara blew her whistle and asked if the boy had time for this one. She said he said right, she said it was a beautiful and mysterious sound, and then suggested the boy try it. Meliara started to remove the chain to give the boy a whistle. At this point, the boy started coughing. The main character asked if he was okay. She asked if he had a pain somewhere, but at that moment it saw blood on his shirt and arm. Meliara realized the boy was infected and cradled him to her and told the boy not to come near her. She knew that coughing up blood meant the disease was progressing, and since she was in the neighborhood, she must already be infected. She thought she would slow the infection at all costs until the priests arrived. Until then, she would suffer alone. But at that moment, Licht grabbed Meliara's arm. The main character was surprised and said to let her go because he would get sick. Afterwards, Licht took the boy's hand and began to examine it. After that, he saw one of the signs of contamination. At that moment, Meliara wondered what would happen if she caused the Archduke to become infected. At this point, she shouted that she didn't want to. After these words, a light appeared in the protagonist's hands. Linden asked what it was. Meliara was confused because she didn't realize what she had just done. But afterwards, Licht told her to watch. The protagonist saw that the pigment spots on the boy's arm had disappeared. At this point, the boy told the protagonist that he felt better. He asked if she, as a priest, had cured him. Meliara wanted to say she didn't, but Licht told her she was the one who did it. He said there's no doubt she helped him. The protagonist was surprised and said she didn't have any powers. Well, that's when John Doe shouted that it was her. They said that the main character has the noblest energy, the purest voice, and is as beautiful as the moon itself. They said she was the one they'd been waiting for. The main character was terrified because she didn't realize who these people were. But at that moment, another girl came along and said that was enough, and she said the main character was speechless because of them. Meliara looked at the girl and marveled at the aura around her. At that moment, this girl she didn't know approached Meliara and apologized for scaring her. The main character didn't smile and say it was okay, but she asked who this girl was. A non-acquaintance asked permission to introduce herself. Her name is Lydia. She is the high priest of the Lunarians who worship the moon god. After a while, not everyone was gathered in the same room. Lydia said that now that they're here, you don't have to worry about spreading disease anymore. Meliara thanked the girl, but she was surprised. She said they hadn't had time to send them a letter and asked how they knew. But Lydia said Meliara had been whistling recently. Meliara said she had, but she said she didn't think they'd hear her from so far away. Lydia said that this whistle contains divine energy, so they can hear it wherever they are. But she said that, however, not everyone is given the opportunity to use the item. Lydia said that only the one chosen by the moon god could whistle into it. Saint of Lunars. At that moment, Lydia stood up and asked for permission to formally greet the main character. Then she fell on her knees before Meliara and said that she, Lydia, the servant of the moon, had waited a very long time for this meeting. But Meliara stood up and said it was impossible. She said there must be some mistake. Lydia asked Meliara why she was so sure of that. The main character didn't say she met a son once, and he said she had no holy magic. It was because of this that Meliara was bullied by her own father. The protagonist thought that he had no right to be a parent, and if he should have told his face about it. At that moment, Lydia asked if the feeble-minded old man had really said such a thing. She said that the attitude between priests of different religions certainly leaves a lot to be desired. But Lydia said that however this fool just took and kept silent. When met the Holy Lunar, Lydia asked what she should do to him for such a thing. At this moment, the main character did not think that the girl seemed to laugh, but she was still scared. Nodia said there's no way to get him for lying. She said that Meliara really didn't have the holy magic of the Solnus. Linden asked, so the main character really is a saint of the moon god. At that moment, one of the followers of the religion stood up and said, "Just listen." She asked the boy if he dared to doubt the words of their high priest. But Lyndon awkwardly said it was about something else altogether. Meliara was very surprised that the girl was being so disrespectful to the prince. At this point, Lydia said what she thought. Her inference is correct, and there are many reasons why the main character is a saint, but the main one is the amount of holy magic. Lydia said that even with such tremendous power, only 2 people have it at the moment. The protagonist didn't realize if one of them was Saint Olivia. Meliara asked what if someone with more holy magic showed up. She asked if he would be the one with the most holy magic. But Lydia said no. She said that there had been no saint for centuries, and there was no record of 2 blessed children at once. At this point, Meliara asked even if she was the chosen one why her magic still hadn't manifested. But Lydia said nothing shows up right away. She said that from birth there is a special power in a child, and it takes a long time to discover it. She said that the holy power of the Lunarians comes from the soul, but because the body mediates for it, it will only happen when the body and soul are in balance. Lydia said she got her powers when she was 4, and the priests who came with her as teenagers. Meliara didn't realize if this meant that the wielder of this magic originally had her soul, but she decided it was rubbish because she's just an ordinary office plankton. At this point, Lydia asked Meliara if she had any special markings on her skin. She said that when the force appears, a similar pattern appears. At that moment, the protagonist remembered something. It was a memory from her past life. A friend asked her if she had a tattoo, but the main character asked if she was talking about the birthmark. She said it looked really cool. Her friend was surprised and said it was really like a tattoo. The protagonist realized she'd seen this thing on Meliara's body too, but she wrote it off as a coincidence. The protagonist wondered if she was really a saint of the moon god. The next day, people were treated en masse. Meliara sat watching this, and at that moment she was asked why she was sitting alone. It was Lyndon. The protagonist explained that just as she was about to start helping the sick again, the priests just kicked her out. Lyndon smiled and said they were very persistent. But Meliara remembered a guy saying that a saint had taken his hand and he would never wash it again. She said he probably wouldn't. The protagonist realized that they reminded her of a group of fanatics, so she was afraid of them. Lyndon said that with their help everyone would recover quickly and they were very lucky. Meliara remembered Lydia saying that the magic of the soulness was good for bruises or broken bones, since their purpose was to treat infectious diseases. Meliara said that was true, and they were lucky to have contacted them. Lyndon asked the protagonist if she could use holy power too. Meliara said she was still learning the basics, but she said she could do some things now though. At this point, the protagonist asked Lyndon if he wanted to touch. Lyndon asked in surprise if he was allowed. The main character smiled happily and said, "Of course you can." The guy asked her if she would show him anything else. Well, at this point, he said he didn't need anything and apologized for bothering me with his requests. Meliara tried to calm the guy down and said there was no need to apologize. She continued to use magic and told him to watch as long as he wanted. Meliara said she'd keep showing it to him until she used up all the magic. She asked if he thought she was burdened to do anything for him. At night, a snake came to Licht and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The snake then turned into a man and called Licht his brother. Sergei told Licht that he was looking. He only had 1 dog left, not counting the Tanma. But Licht asked his brother if he had forgotten that he had no right to harm people. However, the well is still poisoned. Licht told his brother that he knew he did it. Licht said this kind of poison can only be found in the demon world. Licht said that fortunately the amount was too small for the amount of water available, so people didn't die immediately. But Licht told his brother that too many people died because of him anyway. He asked if he thought he could get away with it. But Sergei asked him why he was such a bore. He said that they both know very well that the demands of the contracting party are special. He asked if he could have forgotten about it. Sergei asked if when the younger brother is a great demon king, the elder would dare to go against the laws of the underworld. Licht realized that his brother was using his power to charm him. At that moment, Sergei asked his brother if the Lord had been living in the human world for too long. He asked if he could forget his true identity. Sergei said he might have to replace him. But at this moment, Licht used magic on him and said that it seems that due to his absence, he had already forgotten what he had lost in the last power battle. He asked if he needed to be reminded. Licht told his brother he'd shown him enough mercy. He said he wouldn't move if he didn't want to lose the other horn too. After that, Licht began to walk away from his brother. Sergei asked him if he thought he was the strongest. He said if he'd been in his shoes 100 years ago and met that girl then. At this moment, Sergei's magic crystal began to vibrate. The guy grabbed him and said they'd look at it some more. After the arrival of the priests, the disease began to recede. But there was another problem. There was no longer a threat to life, but that did not mean that people were completely healthy. And there was only one doctor in the village, Glavnak Uyug, where the heroine happily said she was going to go pick herbs. But in the evening, the protagonist was very tired. She just didn't want to be idle, but she didn't understand why she thought she could do the job. Meliara worked from morning till night for 3 days. And when I almost made it to my room yesterday, I fainted shamefully again. At that moment, the protagonist entered the room. But there were guys waiting for her inside and she asked what they were doing here. Lyndon asked her if she was okay. Meliara said she did. She explained that she felt better after sleeping. But Lyndon said that yesterday she had frightened them with her fainting spell. He said everyone was very worried. Meliara smiled at the guys and thanked them. She apologized to Lyndon for causing her so much trouble, but the guy said she wasn't. At this point, Licht approached the protagonist and told her that she didn't need to work so hard. He said if she was just tired, she could say so. After that, he hugged the main character. He told her in her ear that everyone has a limit, and that's just the way it is. In a past life, the main character was standing with her friends and talking. One of her friends said she was playing a game yesterday and her mum hit her on the head. The other friend was surprised and said it must have hurt. At this point, the main character said she had the same thing. She said that she got bumped while watching YouTube. She was told that she would forget to eat like that. At this point, her friends looked at the protagonist strangely. Meliara asked if something was wrong. One of her friends asked if the teacher from the orphanage hit her. The other one asked if she should report it. But Meliara said she didn't have to do that. She said she knew the teacher well and they were very friendly. At this point, her friends started asking her if she was often beaten and if it hurt. They asked if she was being threatened. The friends even wanted to report her instead, but Meliara said they didn't. She said it was just like her mom's case. But a friend told the protagonist that a stranger hit her. She said that if things got worse, the protagonist should tell them, and they would protect her. But Meliara was surprised. She didn't understand what they were talking about. She thought her life was no different from theirs. As a child, even the smallest nagging seemed wrong to others. And after that incident, she thought she would never show her weaknesses to anyone again. But Meliara realized that it seemed the only thing she needed to hear then was Licht's spoken words. At this point in the guy's embrace, the protagonist cried. Lyndon noticed this and was surprised. He remembered meeting Meliara. He said they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The guy said something about rumors of her coming to the capital. He said she should have told him about it. Meliara wasn't sure, replied that she was grateful that he had come to see her in person, but she said there were too many people watching them. She said his parents don't like her, if they're going to see each other like this and talk. Well, at this point, Lyndon said that the protagonist, Duchess Darches, is the crown prince's fiancé and lover. He said that if the Empire knew that, then why bother? Lyndon said that besides, he thought they could be called friends. He said it's just two people meeting and talking sometimes. But he said that if Meliara was against it, he had no other choice. But at that moment, the protagonist stopped him. She said it's not that she doesn't like it. She said she actually likes talking to him too. She said she wanted to hear about Mr. Zakin. Lyndon smiled and continued their conversation. He thought it was so simple. A woman who lacks love won't refuse even a fake one. He thought maybe they were the same. Lyndon first met Meliara at the temple. Meliara made excuses to her father that she didn't steal the necklace and someone set her up. Then Lyndon thought she had a pretty face but to be a thief as well. But at that moment, her father slapped Meliara and called her a blasphemer. He told the protagonist to apologize to the saint immediately. Lyndon didn't realize that wasn't too much. After all, she is his daughter. The current Duchess of Darches is the only one who, in 3 generations of her family, has managed to become the crown prince's bride. That's why Lyndon got close to her, because of the benefits. At that moment, the boy noticed the redness on Meliara's wrist. The main character's excuse was that she just accidentally spilled tea on her hand. Lyndon was surprised that even after getting wounded, she didn't bother to treat it. After watching her for a while, he discovered that her life was no different from his. Because of her father's cold and cruel attitude, Meliara clung to the slightest show of attention, trustingly opening her heart to everyone she met. The boy remembered Meliara just like that. Lyndon remembered Meliara's words that he could find her at any time if he needed help. He didn't realize she'd said something like that before. One of the priests said that he was able to eat with the saint, and even if he went to hell right now, he would still be happy. Meliara wondered if priests went to hell. Then she started laughing and Lyndon thought she could still smile. At first he decided to escort her as he was curious as to why Duke Arvis was taking such an interest in her. But Lyndon didn't understand how it was so. The kid's mom died when he was a kid, and only his grandfather stayed by his side. The emperor tells Lyndon that he is a degenerate mistress, and he needs to know his place. After saying that, little Lyndon cried and ran away. But as he was running, he ran into a girl. She asked him who he was running from. She asked if something was wrong and offered to show him something unusual. After that, the girl used magic, which surprised the guy very much. She told Lyndon to watch as long as he wanted. She said she would keep showing it to him until she used up all the magic. Lyndon didn't understand why things had turned out this way. After a while at the table, Lyndon told Meliara to try the juice. He said it was made from forest berries that grew near the village. Licht in turn offered the girl a tea that helps with indigestion. The protagonist wanted to say no and asked why. But at this point, she noticed the tense atmosphere between the guys and asked to at least let her choose for herself. But at that moment, she was surrounded by priests who offered her a variety of food. The protagonist thought it was too much attention for her alone, but she thought that even so, there was nothing wrong with what others thought of you. Meliara laughed, thanking everyone, and said she would definitely try everything. The protagonist thought her stomach was definitely in for a rough ride. After the meal, the protagonist apologized to everyone and said she would rest in her room. When she left, she said they'd see each other later. But after the protagonist left, Licht and Linden froze. The priests thought they should go too and left, leaving the boys alone. Licht told Linden that if he had something to say, let him say it. You can see by the look on his face that he doesn't. Linden said he'd get straight to the point. He asked why Licht was patronizing the protagonist. He said he was well aware that Licht had never cared about politics or power, but he said that if Licht was going to use Meliara. But at that moment, Licht became indignant and asked Linden if he himself hadn't used it. The guy wanted to justify himself but stopped himself. He said that was once upon a time, but it's different now. Licht explained that he wanted to be sure about something about the array. Linden asked incredulously at the fact that Meliara was a saint of the Lunarians, but Licht said it was none of his business. At this point, Linden told the guy that if he continued to harass her like this, there was nothing left for him to do but stand up for her. Licht got angry and told the guy to then get rid of all the nastiness inside him for starters. At that moment, Licht saw a silhouette above Linden. He said it looks like the guy got a blessing from a saint, but that's not the power of the Solars. Linden was surprised and asked what he was talking about. Licht explained that he had no hatred for their energy. It was the opposite of the moon god's power, nothing more. But he said that, however, the energy that surrounds Linden is fake. Linden asked if he meant to say that the blessing of the saint is just a hoax, but Licht said it's up to the guy to lie or cheat. Lastly, Linden asked Licht why he had told him about it. Licht replied that compared to the dim-witted emperor and crown prince, who were unable to distinguish between good and evil, Linden might be smarter. Licht told the lad that if he wanted to know more, the incident with the unexpected illness would serve as a good lead. A fire was lit outside and people danced and ate around it. At this point, Linden told the protagonist that tomorrow they would be leaving this place and he couldn't believe it. Meliara said that she really didn't want to leave. She thought that these days were proving to be the busiest since her arrival in this world. But she thought it was a great blessing that everything in the village was now as it was before. At that moment, Linden asked Meliara if she wanted to dance. The main character refused and said it wasn't hers. Linden was surprised and said he had heard and she used to really like dancing. The main character said that just because she likes them doesn't mean she's good at them. At this point, Linden asked Meliara if she had always worshipped the moon god. Meliara said her family believes in the sun god, but she said she was a non-believer herself. Linden was surprised and asked if it was possible that she didn't believe in any god. This is the moment the main character wondered if there are atheists in this world. She said she is not an atheist, however she leans towards antagonism. She said it's not that she doesn't believe in a god, she just doesn't recognize any of the existing ones yet. Meliara said that it was more accurate to say how they could create even the most primitive image of a deity, and based only on the norms common to humans. She said that she believed that not much was known about it yet. Meliara said that generally speaking all gods are awesome. At this point there was silence, and Meliara became embarrassed and didn't realize what she had even blurted out. But at that moment Licht said it best. He said that each deity is beautiful in his own way. Meliara stammered and told the guy not to mock her. This moment Licht took the protagonist by the hair and said to however she remembered that even if believe in God, no she is in any case the infinitely beloved child of the moon. He said she gets infinite love, and just has to believe it. The main character told Licht that he gets it too, and not only that. Meliara said that in front of the priests and others she would not say anything related to doubts regarding the faith, so the guy could take it easy. Licht tried to say he didn't mean it, but the heroine stood up and said she'd go first. She said she'd had too much to drink so she was tired. The main character left and told the guys to enjoy the evening. Well, when the main character came into the room she fell to the floor. She didn't understand why Licht had suddenly said something that her heart still couldn't rest. Meliara thought he worshipped the moon god, so there was a sense of unease in his words. Meliara thought she had been consoled and she seemed to need to calm down, but the protagonist didn't understand why her heart was beating so hard. The main character didn't realize if Licht was treating her so well because she was a saint, just like the priest that fell in love with her from the first time they met. Meliara thought that she remembered Licht saying that she was the moon's chosen one, but she didn't understand why she was so sure. But at that moment she stood up and thought she'd had enough of thinking about it. At this moment a servant approached Linden in the street and addressed him. He said he'd just received the information he'd asked for and offered to step back. After that they went to a remote place so no one would hear them. Linden asked and what they had been able to find out about the Solari saint. The boy began to tell me that according to a reliable source, Mrs. Olivia disappeared from the temple a couple of days ago, and her body was found nearby. Guy asked Linden if he thought St. Olivia was here. The next day, the main character asked what was wrong. She saw a carriage being pulled by slugs. Meliara didn't know if I was dreaming. The butler told the protagonist that he heard she got carsick in the carriage. He said that's why he had prepared more comfortable transport. Meliara didn't realize he was talking about a carriage of giant slugs. The butler asked the protagonist if this was the first time she had seen such a thing. He said it was a local exclusive. He said they were fast enough despite their appearance. And he said the main character could meet them before she went. He said she should just walk up. Although the main character didn't want to, she came over. She was uncomfortable because she didn't hate slimy things. At this point, she touched and expected the worst. But at that moment, Meliara realized that the sensation was quite different than she had expected. It's not slimy at all, it's very clean. Like a plate after washing. Meliara thought they were really cute and now she loves slugs. Linden didn't realize whether Meliara really liked the horse that much. Why Linden sees horses instead of slugs, it's all about the illusion paper. Magic works only on ordinary people. The representatives of Dima's race, saints, and people associated with them see their true appearance. At that moment, Licht walked over to Meliara and said it was time for them to leave. After Meliara got into the carriage and asked what about Lydia and the priests, Licht explained that they could teleport so a carriage was not necessary. In the carriage, Meliara told Licht that they say the temple is in Chiban warriors. She asked if there weren't people there who could keep an eye on it. She asked if maybe they should be contacted first. But Licht said it's about the shortage of priests, not the fact that the temple is closed. At that moment, Meliara looked out the window and told Linden that they were leaving soon. The guy smiled and said he was on his way. At that moment, the protagonist mentally said goodbye to this village. She thought she had been very busy because of the illness incident, but luckily everything ended happily, and she thought it was safe to go to Chiban village. Well, at that moment, a servant came running to Linden. He said his grandfather was in critical condition. The main character didn't realize if everything was going to be all right with Linden. After all, she realized she was agreeing with the exact time his grandfather died. This moment, Meliara approached him and asked him how he was feeling. She asked if his grandfather had any symptoms. Linton said that sometimes he faints, but nothing else. He said maybe this time he'd be okay. Meliara didn't think it was that simple. That's when Linton smiled gently and told Meliara not to worry. He said that there were many famous doctors near Grandpa. Then he suggested that the protagonist go because the sun was already setting. But the main heroine stopped him. She told the guy to go to his grandfather's. Linton wanted to say that he'd already said it was okay. But the main character interrupted him and told him not to lie to her. She asked if he wanted to go east because of her. Meliara said the crown prince's engagement was broken. She asked if he wanted her to take his side. Meliara said this is the moment when she can come clean about being kicked out of the house. She said that her father said she had dishonored their noble mouths, so he was getting in to take her name off the family tree. Meliara said she agreed to it. She said that's why she traveled east to start a new life. So she can no longer be a figure to be used in politics, for she is no longer the crown prince's bride. Meliara said that's why Linden should go to his grandfather's house sooner, because he must have missed him. Well, that's when the guy backed out. The main character stood there, not understanding what was going on. Linden thought he didn't get close to her because she had high status. He told Meliara that originally, of course, that was the reason. At this point, the main character told the guy she didn't hate him. She said she just wants him to stop wasting his time on her until she's brought him enough walls to love. At this point, Linden asked the protagonist not to say that. He said it was as if he meant nothing to her. He asked that the main character let him choose for himself who to be with, and decide who was more important. So he asked the protagonist not to say such words again. At this point, Linden asked the protagonist if she could show him the magic she was creating with her power. Meliara was surprised and told her that of course she would show her. At this point, the main character began to conjure. Afterwards, Linden asked her why she never asked why he was asking her to do this. Ask the main character why she needs to know. She says it's magic that doesn't take much effort and she's just doing it for him. Linden said that's how it is and he can't do that. From childhood, he was surrounded by those who wanted to sell his personal information to the imperial family to benefit themselves. Linden had to prove to these people that he was useful. Linton was sitting at his desk working on documents. He said he didn't realize the deeds to the right of possession had been forged. He said that you were stupid, that he would give a huge amount of money for it, but that he would not accept being suspected of fraud. A moment he asked someone they might have a problem without this paper. If Linden was asked to do something, he immediately looked for a benefit. Linton asked if he would help them now, what he would get in return. He also learnt to get what he wanted from those who despised him. Linden said that's the kind of man he is, calculating every favor. He said that's what kept him alive. He said Meliara was the first to come to him for no other gain. He said that if they had met again in that hotel, he would never have pursued her. Meliara thought that was actually what she wanted. Linden said it was because then, instead of demonstrating her magic, she would just say go back. Linden said he could visit his grandfather and see her power. Linden said it's difficult because the main character is the first person after his mom and granddad who he can't calculate. At that moment, he said he was going to visit his grandfather, and these words made the protagonist very happy. She said that's great. But Linden asked if she was glad of their separation. At the afterwards, the guy smiled and said he knew she was just worried about him. The main character didn't get embarrassed and deflated by the question of whether Linton was always like this. Afterwards, Linden took the protagonist's hand and kissed it like a gentleman. He said that hearing something like this makes you want to get more great things from the main character. But at that moment, Licht came over and grabbed the protagonist's arm. He said it looked like they were done and had to go. The protagonist reaps Linda a safe journey to the capital. As the protagonist walked in, Lyndon called out to her. He asked if from their next meeting he could call her Ara too. The main character didn't smile and say that of course she did. When Meliara left, she thought that she hadn't spent much time in this village, but she had grown attached to it. And now she was sad about it. At that moment, the protagonist saw that something was wrong with Licht. At this point, she said he looked bad and asked him if something was wrong. But Licht said no, although the main character thought his face was giving him away. Meliara wondered if she'd done something wrong. Licht said that's not true at all. He said the main character did nothing wrong. Said it wasn't her fault. At this point, the main character asked the guy why he was going east. Licht explained that that was his home. Meliara was surprised and said that meant he was from the east. She said she had heard it was very spacious and asked what kind of place it was. Licht told me that there's apparently a Milky Way, and a lot of unusual creatures live there, but said the main character would definitely like it. Meliara said it sounded very interesting. She said she wanted to go there someday. At this point, Meliara thanked Licht and said that at least it wasn't a promise. She said that if she had time, she would definitely come. But first, she needs to get to the ruins of the Moon Temple to be officially released as a saint. She also needs to find Kion. At that moment, the protagonist remembered that she was going to escape. She didn't understand how she could forget that soon this world would be destroyed by the Demon King. At that moment, Licht asked the protagonist if everything was all right. At that moment, Meliara wondered what he would say if she admitted that she wanted to get away from him. The protagonist decided she couldn't pretend to be in front of Licht, Lyndon, Tanma, or Kelbert. Not even in front of other people. She couldn't do it for the sake of escaping. At that moment, the protagonist thought she might eat and say all this to Lydia when she became a saint. Meliara thought that if she said she heard the Eye of God, then maybe people would believe her. At this point, Licht asked Meliara if she was questioning whether being a saint was worth it. The main character was surprised and said it wasn't true. The title pressured her at first, but she can use it to influence other people. At this point, Licht asked Meliara where she was going to live when she became a saint. The main character said she didn't know and maybe in the main temple. She said she heard Lydia lives there too. Licht said the main temple is certainly nice, but he said saints usually live in special places. He asked what about his house. He said it would be comfortable to live there because it's a huge estate and a large area. Licht said the garden was full of flowers, and if she needed anything, he would get it for her. Meliara didn't realize if the guy was now trying to convince her to live together. At that point, she laughed and said that was great. She said she would move in with him as soon as she was officially a saint. The main character thought the guy had a sweet side. Meliara thought that in truth no one cared for her as much as Licht, who had also sworn. At this point, the protagonist asked Licht when she became a saint whether his promise to protect her would still stand. Meliara said that the elephant vowed that he was going to give the Lake of Moonlight. Let him promise no matter what danger Meliara oppresses them. But even if the world turns over, he will always protect her. The protagonist thought that with a trustworthy man like Licht at her side, she wouldn't have to worry about a bad outcome. It's a little awkward to ask him to do that, but guarding a saint is usually a common thing. Licht took the protagonist's hand and said that of course if that's what she wanted. After that, he promised to protect the protagonist at all costs. At that moment, the carriage stopped and the protagonist fell on top of the guy. But at that moment, they were announced that they were on the spot in the village of Chiban. When the protagonist came out, she asked Licht if the priests and Lydia had made it. Licht said they had probably arrived early and were waiting. Meliara realized that teleportation made it possible to travel long distances quickly. She didn't know if she should go with them next time. But at that moment, Licht turned to the protagonist. He asked why she asked him for protection. He asked if there was something wrong. Meliara said that anything could happen when she became a saint. She knew not to tell him that the end of the world was coming. At that moment, Licht said that no matter what happened, his vow would stand, and no harm would come to her, since he will always be on her side. At this point, the protagonist thanked the guy. She thought he was like a trustworthy knight from a love novel. When the coverage saw the main character, they were very excited. Meliara asked them if everyone had made it without adventure. The priest said they had missed her very much. They said they'd already rented her a room, cleaned it, and lit it up. They said they also prepared fresh fruit for her. The main character thanked them. She said that they must be hungry and offered to eat together. Well, at this point, the main character asked the priests what their names were. She said it was a bit strange to have to address every priest all the time. She apologized and said she should have asked their names earlier. Now she felt awkward doing it. Well, at this point, the priests cried. They said that the saint asked their names and they would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Well, at that point, one guy told the others to calm down. He said if the saint asked, we should answer her quickly. The first girl's name was Urin Equit. She's 22 years old. Jurin told me that the tallest guy is Peter. He's a couple of years younger than her. And the red hair is Zion. Jurin said they are all brothers and sisters that serve God, so no one gets hung up on age. She said that ever since she found out the Lunars hadn't had a saint for a long time, she had always feared that she would never be able to meet her. but she said she was lucky enough to meet the protagonist in person, and it's a big deal. She said those two thought the same thing. But the main character said she hasn't been officially made a saint yet. Jurin asked if Mrs. Lydia had any doubts, but she said it was very strange. Jurina said that she could feel Meliara's special power as a saint coming from her. She asked if that wasn't proof of what. Jurin said that when the infection spread through the village, she saw the protagonist working hard to help people. She said that even if the words of the High Life about the saint do not come true, the main character is still a good person. Jurin said that although in truth she wouldn't mind if Meliara became a saint, but at that moment she was called. Jurin told Meliara it was time to go to the table. She said they would eat and then go to the temple. After a while on the way to the temple, Meliara was tired and asked how long they had to walk. Lydia pointed to the top of the mountain and said they just needed to get there. She said the place had been abandoned a long time ago, so it was a bit run down. She said the road was a little bumpy. The protagonist wondered if they had built a temple on top of a mountain and wondered why everything was in such a state. Meliara didn't know how she would have felt in her former body, but thought that the aristocrat's body was definitely not meant for such walks. At this point, the main character tripped and began to fall, but she was grabbed by Licht. At this point, he crouched down and told her to climb on top of him. Meliara started to refuse and said it wasn't necessary and she'd get there on her own. But at that moment, the butler asked the protagonist to let Licht bring her in. He said the mountain road was dangerous. If she twisted her leg, they'd be in big trouble. At this point, Peter turned round and asked if the saint had twisted her leg. He asked the protagonist for permission to carry her. He said he'd be her carriage. The protagonist decided she'd rather let Licht do it. When Licht was carrying the main character, she asked him if he was having a hard time. The guy said no, but he said he didn't think she would. Meliara told him not to laugh because it's embarrassing, but Licht said he was telling it like it is. At least she ate well this time. At this point, the protagonist said she was forever in his debt, but Licht said she was worried for nothing. Afterwards, he said she'd changed and called her Era. At this point, Meliara said she wanted to be declared a saint as soon as possible. She said then she could officially make him her protector. Also, being a saint, she'll be able to see the other side of Licht. At this point, Peter said they had finally made it. Meliara looked and was very surprised at the beauty of the place. Lydia called out to the main character and said she had to go here. On the way, Meliara said she thought the temple would be cold since it was abandoned, but it was beautiful. The main character said it was very unexpected. Lydia said that was true. However, she told Meliara that the place hasn't been cleaned in a long time, so you have to be careful. After a while, they came to the bowl and Meliara asked what it was. Lydia said it was the religion of the temple and asked the protagonist to pick it up. But when Meliara picked it up, light began to emanate from it. The protagonist was surprised to hear Lydia say that water suddenly appeared in the bowl. Lydia explained that when the vessel is touched by a person with lunar power, it fills up on its own. She told the main character to take the bowl with her and follow her. Lydia told me that every ham has a special column. She said that it was the first thing that would be destroyed by the leches. If this floor is destroyed, the temple itself is destroyed. Lydia asked the protagonist if she could pour water into this column. After the protagonist had done so, Lydia said that it would now be necessary to tap into the divine power of this place. She said it felt like a slow absorption of energy. The main character tried to do what she was told. After that, a pillar of light appeared from the pillar. The water began to spread around. After that, a bright light appeared in the sky. And afterwards, a shield formed there. Lydia explained that it was a relic passed down 100 years ago. And she said there's only one person in the world who can get it. At that moment, the protagonist realized that somehow there was no thrill. She realized that she felt as if she was seeing him for more than just the first time. The feelings of emotion emanating from the account, the protagonist's main character seemed as if she was transferring all her love to someone else. Meliara thought that in truth, she still didn't know if she was recognized as a saint. She didn't think she was good enough for it. Meliara realized that knowing of the disaster, she ran as far away as possible in fear. But she still didn't want to disappoint those who believed in her. So the main character decided to take a risk. She asked the shield if he could give her courage. At this moment, once more, a bright blue light appeared out of nowhere. Afterwards, it was as if the protagonist had absorbed the shield. Afterwards, the priests fell on their knees, saluting the saint. Meliara motioned for them to stand up. At that moment, Licht approached her. She asked he could be with her now as an escort res, right? But Licht just hugged the main character and said he thought so. He said he knew it was her. When Licht looked at the main character, he saw a girl from the past. At this point, Licht let the main character go and said that he swears that until this world falls. And while all the wishes of the protagonist are not realized, he will stay by her side and shielding her from any evil. Licht asked if Meliara would let him do it. Everyone had already gathered and Licht had the main character on his back. Lydia told him she would contact them when she had finished preparing in the main temple for the sainthood ceremony. Afterwards, she said goodbye. Butler said that the main character was tiring of using her divine powers. Afterwards, Licht carried her into the carriage and asked the butler to give him a blanket. At that moment, Licht told the butler that he seemed to be in a better mood. The butler asked him why he should be bad. He said that the man he'd been waiting for 100 years had finally arrived. So soon His Majesty will return to the underworld, which has been waiting for its master for a long time. The butler told Licht that, like him, he had been looking forward to this moment, so there was no limit to his joy. After that, Licht stepped into the carriage. He sat down next to Meliari and put her head on his shoulder. Well, at that moment, the girl's strength came out and asked if he was going to leave her like that. I asked him if he realizes he's in it, but so much so that he can't get out. She asked Licht if he remembered her words, the words that they descriptively meet again, and that then she wouldn't leave him alone. Licht thought he had waited a century. He thought that even though it had been a long time and her appearance had changed, it was still her. He thought that this time he would protect her. He wanted the main character to just be there for him. Sometime later in the morning, Meliara woke up. She thought she had had a very good dream, but she had already forgotten it. Meliara thought that they didn't skimp on the beds here. It was unusually soft. But at that moment, the main heroine began to look around because she didn't realize where she was. She realized it wasn't like the usual stand and yard. I wonder if she's been dragged into the Duke's house in time. At that moment, the maid asked Meliara if she had a cold. But most importantly, the heroine asked the girl who she was. The maid bowed her head and said her name was Salt. From today, she would be Meliara's maid. The protagonist said that's what it was and apologized. Said she was very worried, but she asked what this place was. Asked if Meliara didn't hear what the host said. The main character remembered Licht asking her what about his house. She thought it was Licht's house. The protagonist asked if this was the mansion to the east, but the racer explained that it was the center bedroom of the main building belonging to Archduke Arvis. The main character said that this is how it is, but at that moment she realized the maid's words and interjected, said it was right. Meliara remembered that in the original names Archduke Arvis was the demon king that destroyed the empire. She thought she had to get out of here. At that moment Meliara started to get up, leaving the maid puzzled. The main character asked the maid where Licht was. She asked if she had seen the man who came with her, but she said she didn't remember anyone else arriving. She said Mr. Arvis was waiting for her at the door. At that moment, Licht entered the room, asked if the main character was awake. Licht, in the guise of a demon, walked through the castle spreading nights. At that moment, he entered the room where the Duke and his wife were. The Duke asked him what had suddenly come over him. She said that she agreed to the promise she had once made, that they would not touch his territory. The Duke asked why, but Licht said it was because Rosa died. The Duke asked what he was talking about. Licht said, well, he's been waiting 100 years. Then he pulled out his sword and said he had to get rid of everything. He said if he didn't, the truth would come out. The main character couldn't believe it. She didn't understand how such a flawlessly handsome man could be a monster. Once it came to Meliara's attention that Licht was a demon, there was no way for her to perceive him any other way. Meliara didn't understand what escape could be talked about if she didn't even have a thought that she might end up in the main antagonist's house. At this point, Licht told the protagonist that lunch was ready, so if she wasn't in any pain, she could go to the canteen. But Meliara said she wasn't hungry right now. Well, that's when her stomach rumbled. Licht said he would serve her here, and Meliara agreed. She thought he'd just told her to eat well, which had moved her to tears. When Meliara came down, she was met by the butler and asked how she had slept this and the night. He said he'd gone to the trouble of setting up the mansion so she wouldn't be disturbed. And I asked him how about a walk after the meal. He said his lordship had a beautiful garden that was being tended. Meliara thanked the butler for the offer, but she thought this was not the time for a casual stroll. But at this point I wondered if he even knew Licht was a demon. At this point, the butler said he was tired of holding back. He advised the protagonist to hurry to the master. After all, if she refused, who knows what he might do. But at this point he said he was joking because she was a special girl to him. But the main character was already offended with the words that she understood him. The protagonist thought that once she became a saint, everything would work out. In the dining room, the protagonist was met by Kelbert. Meliara said that anxiety is unsettling, but with him she always calms down. Well, at this point, the protagonist wondered what the odds were that an animal bred by a demon was not a monster. The main character thought he was just a magical beast of this world. The main character realized that she had been sleeping with the monster all along. She apologized to Kelbert and said they would play with him later. At that moment, she bumped into Licht. The guy asked her what was wrong with her. Licht asked if she was all right. He said that apparently she had already managed to get sick from being outside for so long yesterday. But Meliara thought it was because she had realized something. At that moment, Licht approached her. He said that if he had known she wasn't fully recovered, he would have eaten with her in the room. At that moment, the protagonist realized that this was the Licht she knew. The Licht that had always been sensitive and friendly. The main character thought he was definitely not the villain, but thought he must be. It's just another Archduke Arvis. At this point, Licht started to approach Meliara and said he wanted to do something. He asked if she would call it. Licht said it was a kiss, but that's when his brother showed up. He asked since when did the Demon King show interest in the opposite sex. He said they don't remember him ever acting like that. He asked if this was his little brother's new sweetheart. The protagonist realized that he's a demon too. Licht asked what the hell was through the window like that. Prody asked if he should have politely knocked 3 times on the window. At this point, the snake started hissing at the main character. But Kelbert stepped in. Prody said that as far as he knows, Kelbert only protects who he thinks is his master, but to tear up the boat for an outsider like that. He asked the protagonist if she was a saint. Prody extended his hand and said it was nice to meet you. But at that moment, Licht told Meliara to stay back. Prody asked his brother rather than he had already appropriated the video for himself. Prody said it was so much softer than the previous one, which was so energetic, asked if his tastes had changed in time, asked if it's not about personality but title. Licht asked his brother if the past warning wasn't enough for him. He told his brother to disappear now before he ripped him to shreds. But Prody asked his brother why he was doing this to him. He said he wanted her to give him advice, no more than that. He said that, and the girl behind his back was clearly perplexed. At that moment, Kelbert became huge. Afterwards, Prody offered the protagonist some advice. He told her to be careful of those around her. They might turn out to be demons who have lived for hundreds of years. He said that the previous saint who had trusted one of them so blindly ended up being left fooled and disappeared without a trace. Meliara didn't understand if Licht knew the saint that was before her. She also didn't understand what missing meant. In the original story, Licht is the demon that destroyed the entire empire. Meliara thought that the fact that he'd gotten rid of the saint sounded more convincing than words of defense for her. Prody told his brother that this time he wanted to find her before he did. He said he'd made a mistake, but he could try it now. Afterwards, the protagonist smelled a scent, but afterwards she fell unconscious. At that moment, a demon burst into the room and told the guy not to dare touch Her Majesty. Licht asked the butler why he had brought him, but the butler said they say rabid dogs are best suited for hunting madmen. At this point, Prody suggested that we end it there. He said that this idiot would make it quite difficult to continue the conversation. Before he left, Prody said he'd still see the saint alone. Meliara was already awake and didn't realize if the guy had already left. At that moment, the demon ran to the window and shouted after Prody to just try to get near the lady one more time. At that moment, Licht asked the butler and the muso to leave the room. He said he had something to talk to Meliara about. The butler took the musos and said they obeyed his orders and walked out. At this point, the protagonist asked Licht if he was really the demon king. In a sad voice, Licht confirmed this. Meliara asked but why he didn't tell her before. She said that he even squared the fact that he was Archduke Arvis. Meliara said she was sure he could have told her that at any time. But he didn't. The main character asked the guy to answer why he did what he did. Licht said he couldn't claim to have openly told her everything. Licht said that when people find out he's Archduke Arvis, they automatically fall into 2 categories. Those who want to get close for their own gain, and those who run away in fear. Meliara thought that the original didn't say anything like that. Only that Archduke Arvis was the descendant of an honored state figure. The Archduke had a vast territory and a powerful army. Therefore, he was always feared by those around him. Meliara told the guy that he decided she would do like the others. Licht explained that he wasn't sure at first, which is why he couldn't open up. The main character asked the guy if he knew she was a saint. Licht said he only wanted to make sure she was her. He said he didn't care about the tittle saint. But the main character shouted at him that it was a lie. She said that when she discovered she was a saint, he was happier than the others. Meliara asked exiting. He was only nice to her from the start because she might have that power. The main character thought that Licht's kindness wasn't really meant for her, but for that saint. At this point, Licht said it wasn't that simple. He said he thought it wasn't time to tell her, but he wasn't going to deceive her. But the main character said he did it on purpose and was fooling her. The main character said she believed him. She said she at least thought the one whose actions she had seen all this time was real. The main character said that if she had known from the beginning that it was all a lie, she wouldn't be here. Meliara turned around and said she'd be gone before sunset. At that moment, Licht stopped her. He said he'd been looking for her for so long, but afterwards he let the protagonist go. When she left, she said she hated lying men. The main character was lying on the bed crying. She thought she said she would go, but she doesn't have a carriage or money, so she can't. All she can do is cry. At that moment, Meliara wondered how Licht was doing. She thought he must be really angry. The main character thought that those words were Dima's. She realized that of course she was not going to believe every word. But she thought Licht was really the demon king who would destroy this world. But at that moment, Meliara wondered why he even did it like that all of a sudden. The protagonist remembered that in the novel he had said it was because Rose had died. But the protagonist thought it was a bit odd that it was caused by an ordinary flower. On the protagonist, she didn't understand why it hurt her more, not from his lies, but from the realization that he was an acquaintance of the previous saint. At that moment, there was a knock on the room and the protagonist thought it was Isolde. She said to come in. At that moment, Licht entered the room. He asked if she'd give him some time. He said he wanted to show her something. Afterwards, they came to a garden of amazing beauty. Meliara was surprised, for she did not realize that there was such a place in the Archduke's domain. At this point, they came to some sort of statue. At that moment, Licht asked the protagonist to come over. The main character walked up and saw a rose in a flask. She asked if it was definitely Rosa. Licht said that's right. He said that's why she's so radiant. Licht said that this rose is made from pieces of the shower that the saint left behind 100 years ago. Meliara thought it was right that they weren't just acquaintances. Licht said it was true that he had been waiting for the goddess's messenger, and though his joy that she had become one was real, Licht said he was still surprised by this outcome. He said he had to bide his time to make sure she was back. Licht said you probably find that hard to believe, but he said she was the one he'd been waiting for all along, and they finally met 100 years later. The main character asked what the hell he was talking about. I thought she wasn't even the real Meliara, and just a girl who happened to fall into the world of romance and took over someone else's body. The main character told Licht she wasn't the one he was waiting for, but Licht said it was her. The main character asked and how he would check it out, but at that moment Licht opened the flask. He said that the pieces of soul encased in the rose only respond to the same soul. He said that even if the host looks different, the flower can't be fooled. The main character realized that she was getting her soul, and it was identical to the one the saint had 100 years ago. Licht told the protagonist that she did say that they would definitely meet again someday. Promised she wouldn't leave him alone. At this moment Licht hugged the main character and fell on her shoulder. He said he believed, and he'd been waiting for her for a century. He asked that she not leave him again. Nothing happened last night. This guy is a skillful Muso worker that keeps an eye on the house during the absence of Mr. Tanma and His Majesty. He's not that important a character, so we can end it there. Plus, he's got a great attitude. All because Mr. Tanma had recently introduced him to Her Majesty. The butler introduced the protagonist's boyfriend and said that from now on, she could assign any small jobs to him. Meliara told the boyfriend that it was a pleasure to meet him and asked if they had met before. Muso said he couldn't believe she was the day he was able to meet the lady again and introduce himself properly. He said she had no idea what an honor it was for him. The butler told the protagonist that as she sees Muso as a very noisy guy, however quite useful. He said he would even be happy to be made a slave. The protagonist didn't think that somehow it sounded more like an insult. At this point, she drew the guy's arm around her and said hopefully they'd get along. Muso got very excited and thought the main character was an angel. Remembering that beautiful smile, Muso was convinced again that he was incredibly honored to be able to help such a magnificently human being. He swore that wherever Her Majesty was, he would run to her at the first call, overcoming fire, water, and slow pipes. All the while, the boy was being watched by the main character, and she thought she knew he was the only one here. This very morning, the main character asked the guy if he was waiting for her too. She asked if they'd known each other 100 years ago, but Muso said it's no wonder she doesn't remember anything. But he said it was okay because he remembered her, as clear as yesterday. But the butler told the guy to stop this nonsense and go sweep the yard. Licht tells Meliara that she is a saint who disappeared a century ago, but she still doesn't understand anything. The protagonist decides that first she needs to find out what kind of person she was back then. The main character has decided that to do this, she needs to get as much information out of the Muso as possible. Well, when the main character started to walk up to the guy, she stepped on a branch. Muso heard the sound and thought it was a thief and started using magic. A guy saw the main character and started running to her and asking if she was okay. He said he thought it was a stranger sneaking in. Meliara said she was fine. She explained that she was just passing by. Meliara thought the guy was naive, but she thought nothing could fix a demon. The saint prayed. Well, at that moment she noticed Prodi and asked what he was thinking about. The man asked the priests to come out of the way. The priests apologized and said that everyone was now praying holy prayers. They said it was not allowed to interrupt the prayer. The Duke asked if they were crazy. He said Levi was still sick. The saint asked Dima what was wrong with him. She said he didn't seem like himself at all. She said he was very quiet. Prodi asked what's wrong. He asked if she is sad because he doesn't tell her the time. Levi said that's not true. She said it's just that it's like he's not here, that's what she's worried about. But Prodi said that's a lie. He said she only cared that at some point she'd be abandoned. After Prodi kissed the entourage, she said it was a temple. She said she was doing business elsewhere. But Prodi asked since when did she care about such things. He said they've done it here before. Prodi asked, so it's unlikely that anyone will come here. Prodi asked if he was wrong, but the saint said he was right. Prodi said it would be nice if she wasn't a false saint. About this point, Evie asked why he was doing this. But Prodi asked what if she was real, she wouldn't fall for his charms. Prodi thought his brother was getting all the power for himself, waited 100 years, found a new saint. But he thought it was kind of weird. He thought his brother wasn't that interested in keeping his place as Demon King. Prodi thought that he was also acting as if that girl wasn't just a new acquaintance to him. At this point, the Duke started calling for the entourage and said he had something to tell her. He asked if he could come in for a moment. Prodi said the saint was only good for flatulence anyway. At that moment, the Duke rushed in and the saint was lying on the ground. He asked if she had prayed again, even though she was sick. He said that he could see he was saying that she should rest. But Levy said she was fine. She said there was nothing to worry about and she was just a little tired. The Duke said she hadn't fully traveled yet after accepting me. This is the moment Duke thought the protagonist would pay for what she'd done. The main character sat with Muso and the latter asked why they were sitting like that. The protagonist remembered how Licht had told her last night that if she got tired, she'd better get some rest. After that, the guy started to walk away, but the main character clicked it. She asked what kind of person she was 100 years ago. Licht said she was a very strong yet loving woman. He said she had a lot of confidence. He said that he had made a promise to himself from the first time they met that she would fall in love with him. Meliara wondered if this wasn't romantic nonsense. Licht said that's what ended up happening. Meliara asked, meaning that the rose that contained a piece of her soul had not wilted in the last century. Meliara asked Licht what he would do if Rose suddenly died. Licht said that if that really happened, it would mean she was dead. He said that if that were the case, she would no longer be in this world, so her coming back could be forgotten. Licht said then he would have lost her forever. He said that if that happened one day, he'd hate the world for taking her away, and in an instant it would destroy all life. The main idea asked why go that far. Licht asked, isn't it clear? He thought it was because of her that he recognized how beautiful the flowers were. I mean, there are other things in the world besides blood and fighting and not hate. It was the first time he had ever been looked at with such a loving gaze. It was as if the sun and the moon were warm in her presence. It seemed to Licht that everyone lived only for her. He said he'd only waited until now because she'd once promised to meet again, and because that rose didn't wither. Licht said that if he could never see her again, flowers or even things laughing wouldn't matter to him. He asked what good it does to exist where there is none. But Licht said he's around now, so he doesn't want to think about such terrible things. After that, he wished Meliara good night and left. That night, Meliara never managed to sleep. It seemed to her that this time she had finally been able to look into the soul of the very Licht she had pretended not to know. Rubbish asked the main character if she was okay. He said she just looked so strange and asked if she was sick, but the main character said she just thought for a second. Last night she kept racking her brain and finally came to a conclusion, that it's just going to stay here. Meliara thought she'd run away from home anyway, just so she wouldn't die. When she found out she was the missing saint, Licht seemed to change her mind about destroying the world. So the main heroine decided that to begin with it is necessary to collect at least some information about her past. Musa asked if she wanted to find out what kind of person she was 100 years ago. Meliara confirmed it. Trash suggested asking His Highness then. The heroine told the guy that he just gives her confidence. Muso cried and said he would do anything to get her memories back. The main character thought that the guy was too confident to say that because it's obviously not easy. At this point, Musa said that Meliara must be uncomfortable and offered to eat on this one wearing a handkerchief. At this point, Meliara asked the guy why he was being so nice to her. Although when the protagonist thought about it, she realized that Musa wasn't the only one treating her like this. Everyone else around her behaves the same way. The guy explained it was simple. He said she was his savior. So who gave him the name? The main character said that 100 years ago she really was her own imaginative girl. But she thought that still how could she call him that, even though he was really just like a rhinoceros. Rubbish said that the main character was indeed unusual. He said he'd look once at the dirty and unhappy child from the junkyard. She said from now on he would be called Muso. She said that this name characterized a man who could do anything. But the guy said he wasn't the only one who'd been graced. Muso said that because Tamasama's eyes were different colors, he wore a blindfold all the time. And in the underworld, this is considered a bad sign. However, the protagonist stated that this feature, on the contrary, brings good luck. He has since changed his blindfold to a monocle. At this point, the protagonist cried. Musa was frightened and asked what was wrong with her. The main character didn't understand how it was. Thought the savior who gave the name and the one who turned someone else's complex into a force. The girl you fell in love with waited 100 years after that. Rubbish asked the protagonist not to cry because if anyone saw it. But at that moment, Licht came over and asked what was up. Licht asked Musa if he realized that he would not pay for Meliara's tears with even his paltry life. The boy tried to justify himself and said that Licht had misunderstood. He said that he did not intend to make the lady cry. The main character told Licht he was wrong. At that moment, Licht took the protagonist in his arms. He said that whatever the reason was, they needed to get back to the house first. After Lita told Muso he would deal with him later. The main character was sitting at the table holding a mug of tea. She asked Licht to explain himself. Licht said that saying that when sad, a person might feel better if they tangle themselves in a blanket and drink something warm. Meliara asked who said that. Licht replied that it was her, 100 years ago. He asked if she would tell him why she was crying. He said it was because if it was really Muso's fault, he'd be punished accordingly. But the main character said he had nothing to do with it. She said she was really crying over Licht. She said that so kind to her that tears came to her eyes. Licht breathed a sigh of relief and said she was the only one he always heard such words from. A century ago and now. The main character thought that this girl was again and beat her to it. At this point, the main character asked Licht how he looked at starting over. She was talking about a relationship where two people are not lovers, but not strangers either. She told Licht that she understood his feelings. She said that he must have been overwhelmed with joy when he finally met the person he had waited so long for. But Meliara said that however she doesn't perceive herself as the one she keeps hearing about. Meliara said that she gets more scared every time she realizes that she likes him more and more. She said she is afraid that at some point she will see disappointment in his eyes, because the present her and the past are dirty people. So the protagonists offered to start over. She told Licht she wanted to get to know him better, to know as well as he knows her past. So the main character asked not to be seen as a past saint. Meliara didn't realize if that was too direct. At that moment, Licht smirked, and the main character didn't realize what else that smirk was. Licht said that's how it is. The main character thought it seemed to be the first time Licht had ever smiled like that. Licht told Meliara not to worry. He said he would never be disappointed in her. He said that even though she looks completely different, her soul is the same. He said he's not in love with the shell, but with her very existence. However, if she's still concerned. Licht promised that he would only look at the current Meliara from now on. He said he would try to take things slow since it troubled her heart so much. But Licht wondered if she would be able to forgive him when he was no longer able to contain his own feelings. I mean, she's just adorable. After a while, the main character woke up and the maid asked her how she slept. The protagonist wished good morning to the maid and asked if the father had given them flowers to the gardener. But the maid explained that they were from the master. The maid said tulips are at their loveliest this time of year. But she said that in truth the lord strictly on the stockade forbade them to say so. At that moment, the maid said that a telegram had arrived this morning. Meliara didn't realize who she was from. She thought that no one knew she was here. The main character thought that maybe something happened at the temple. 2 days later, the capital of the Bakarta Empire. The main character arrived with Licht. People were discussing what they said. After the cancellation of her engagement to the prince, she started to lead a reclusive life. But they didn't understand what brought her here. When the protagonist entered the building, she saw Linden. The main character went up to him and said she had heard the news and asked how he was. Linden said he was fine. The main character realized it was a lie. Linden's grandfather was his only family. Linden told the protagonist that his grandfather had gone without pain. At this moment, the crown prince approached the protagonist from behind.